Hey everyone, it's Danny Hooper and a happy new year. Hope everybody's doing okay in this crazy COVID world. I'm coming to you here from my home in Edmonton, and I'd like to welcome you all right now to what should have been our 18th annual Alberta Beef Industry Conference. But of course, because of this farkin' COVID, we can't meet and all get together because our government says we can't, and the government knows what's best for us always. And so anyway, that's the bad news. The good news is this is our first annual virtual conference. And hopefully by 2022, we can get back to the old way of doing things and all get together in Red Deer and meet live and have fun. But nonetheless, we'll move forward. I just want to say before we get too far into today's presentation, and we have an amazing speaker coming up in just a minute, so stick with us. You're going to love this guy. You loved him last year, and due to popular demand, we brought him back. I'm not even going to tell you who he is right now. You probably know because there's probably some notes with this or something on your screen. But let's pretend that you don't know, and I'll build him up and make it sound extra exciting for you. But I just want to say, for those of you who know me, you're probably saying, hey, what's with all of that gray hair and where's your cowboy hat? And I elected this time around on this video session not to wear my hat, just to, I'm going more with this Justin Bieber for 85 to 90-year-old women look. So that's why no hat today. Now, let's get started by thanking, first of all, our sponsors for this year's conference. We know it's a challenging, tough year. Nonetheless, sponsors have stepped up and really helped us put together the best possible virtual conference that we can. And we couldn't do it without the sponsor support. But there's one sponsor in particular that I really want to do a shout out for right now. And that's my extra good friends at UFA. They have been sponsoring me at the Alberta Beef Industry Conference for I don't know how many years. And UFA founded in 1909. It was founded by farmers, for farmers, and it was built on the principle that when we come together, we are just stronger. And nothing has changed in all those years for UFA. Once again, just a quick shout out to my friends at UFA. Thanks for having me back this year. Now, on to today's speaker. This man is brilliant. I saw him for the first time, as anybody who attended last year's conference in Red Deer saw him probably for the first time, unless you've seen him on TV. He's a well-known author, an amazing speaker, and his name is Peter Zeihan. And Peter is the author of three fascinating books. Accidental Superpower is one of his books. The other one is Absent Superpower. And this is the one that I picked up last year at the Beef Industry Conference. It's called Disunited Nations, The Scramble for Power in an Ungoverned World. Now, let me, just so I don't screw anything up, because you know me, Danny Hooper, hate to screw things up. You can take a look at my notes. He's a returning speaker, as I said. He has a deep understanding of geography, demography. I don't even know what that is, but he understands it. And that's why we brought him in, to explain it to people like me who don't know what demography is. Energy and trade, to help his clients make sense of a very complicated and ever-changing world. Now, Fortune 500 companies, trade organizations, policymakers, and government agencies at all levels regularly require his expertise. I've seen him, I know I've seen him on CNN, I've seen him on all kinds of TV business shows. Peter is critically acclaimed author, and if you haven't already done so, make sure that you check out his books. If you haven't read this one's incredible. What I liked about it is there's lots of really interesting maps and charts in it, like this one. Anyway, now, here's what's very cool about Peter's presentation today. First of all, I just want to say this. After I read this book, I didn't want to leave the house before COVID. I didn't want to leave the house during COVID. I'm definitely not leaving the house now after reading this. You're safer at home. But I want to tell you, today we're going to, at the end of Peter's presentation, he is going to be questioned. The Q&A will be handled by our very good friend, Dr. Key Jim. Now, Key needs a little introduction with his industry peers. He's a founding partner of Feedlot Health Management Services, an esteemed cattle producer throughout Canada and the US, and valued board member of many beef industry groups. Key is well positioned to have an open and frank conversation with Peter at the end of his presentation. So this is going to be a Q&A handled by Dr. Key Jim, and I just want to say this. I've seen Dr. Key Jim interview people before, and he is the Barbara Walters of ag industry interviews. Watch closely. I can promise you one thing. He's going to try and make Peter Zeihan cry, as Barbara Walters always does. Anyway, sit back and get ready to enjoy our featured speaker, Peter Zeihan.
Thanks, Danny. That was memorable. I've got some tissues right here, so I'm ready to go with wherever this takes us. This presentation today is actually going to be significantly shorter than the one you guys saw me at about a year ago, because so much has changed. I just want to kind of set the stage for where we are in general. And then Dr. Key and I will have a discussion about drilling down into all specifics for the commodity markets. We figured that was probably going to be the best way to approach this. That was before I realized it was a trap, of course. But let's talk about the world. The world that we understand is an artificial construct. It was something the Americans created at the end of World War II. The Americans decided that we didn't need allies shoulder to shoulder behind us to fight the Soviets or with us to fight the Soviets. We needed them to be in front of us. And considering what the Red Army had just pulled off in Eastern Europe, that was a hard sell. So, as Americans like to do, we just paid everybody. We created this global system, this global order, globalization, that used the United States' Navy to patrol the oceans for everyone so that anyone could sell anything to anyone at any time, safely, without having to go out and conquer anyone, without having to convoy your ships. It was just, could be done. And that generated the greatest expansion in trade, in GDP, and in personal wealth that we have ever seen in human history. But you may have noticed the Cold War is over. And we are now having a belated adjustment to this new world, because the United States no longer can maintain this system, even if it wanted to. You got to ask yourself, if you're going to have a global structure, if you're going to have globalization, if you're going to force everyone to get along, what do you need to have in place? Well, first, you have to have a degree of global interests. And that's something the United States has not had for a very long time. The US economy is the most self-encapsulated economy in the world. We don't trade much with anybody. What we do trade with is largely North America. So there's never been an American economic interest in maintaining globalization. It was always a security play. So that's out. The second thing is a global footprint. Now, this is the number of American troops that have been stationed abroad year by region since the Second World War. And as you can see, it's been slimming down for quite some time. New data is just coming in for calendar year 2020. We now have fewer than 10,000 troops in total across the entire Middle East. That'll go to 0 this year. And we're slimming down our Asian and our European deployments as well. America today has fewer troops stationed abroad than at any time since the 1890s. So even if Americans wanted to maintain globalization, we're no longer physically capable. And then finally, there are the events of January 6th. Now, there are a lot of dark rabbit holes that I've been diving into with clients ever since then. But the one that's most relevant to globalization is that if you're going to have a global foreign policy, if you're going to hold up the collective civilization of humanity, you have to have a bipartisan approach. That can't shift every 4 to 8 years. And one of the many, many outcomes of January 6th is that the United States needs time to itself to figure its own stuff out. And let's assume for the moment that Joe Biden is the guy and that he can fix all of this and get Americans back on the same page, more or less. How long do you think that's going to take him? An hour? His whole term? More time than he has? This is a generational evolution. We're not going to be able to fast forward this, which means that the United States is economically disinterested, strategically incapable, and politically disassociated from everything else that is going on outside of North America. And if you're depending on trade or connections or civility or finance or anything that crosses an ocean, it's over. That's the strategic side of things. Let's talk about some of the economic. Now, this is a standard economic profile: children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. This is Mexico, consumption-led system. Americans love this because it means all those young people, people who are buying cars and homes and raising kids, they're consumers. That's what drives systems. So they buy a lot of American products. In addition, Mexicans are relatively new at their jobs writ large. When you're under 40, you don't have a lot of expertise. So Mexicans do the low end of manufacturing, Americans do the high end manufacturing, and supply chains integrate. So the Mexican-American border is the most crossed border in the world in terms of people, in terms of capital, in terms of products. That is not going to change. 2019 is when Mexico became America's largest trading partner. They will not give up that title in our life. This is a partner, and this is not. The Koreans had a baby bust almost 50 years ago. They've never recovered. Lots of people in their 50s and early 60s, folks that have been at their job for 40 years sometimes. That means they're very highly value added. They really know what they're doing. But there are very few Koreans that are young. So not only does the Korean workforce go head to head with the American workforce, all that product has to be exported. And from an American point of view, they dump it on the market. Now, from a global point of view, from a demographic and economic point of view, from calendar year 1980 to roughly 2015, the world was in a perfect moment because most of the world was mostly consumption-led and the remainder was export-led. So the propensity for trade among those systems when the United States was holding up the ceiling were huge. And all the growth that we saw during the Cold War kind of kicked up into high gear, got even better. But 20 years later, we are all 20 years older. And the math no longer works. We're running out of consumption-led systems, and a lot of the export-led systems are aging into kind of a post-growth retirement sort of network. You can't have economic growth in this sort of structure. It just doesn't work, or at least you can't have trade. So we know that from a strategic, a political, a demographic, and an economic point of view, none of this works anymore. Now, it's not all dark. The United States is a partial exception to what is going on globally. We have a lot of space here, so our birth rate has remained relatively high. We took 7 generations to shift from a primarily rural to a primary urban environment. And that means that people got used to having more kids in the cities than other countries would. In China, for example, they compressed all seven generations of this transition into one. So of course they had absolutely impressive economic growth because you concentrated 200 years of economic development into one, but they're done. The countryside has been emptied out. There are actually not enough people of reproducing age in the countryside to regenerate even it. And the folks that are in the urban centers, in part because of how they live, in part because of one child, they've seen a collapse in their birth rate. It's the fastest collapsing demography in the world. In the United States, we haven't seen that. But the really big thing is what happened with our baby boomer cadre. Now, just like all other baby boomers in the rest of the world, they're nearing mass retirement. The magic year is 2022, so it's really close. But what American boomers did that's unique is they had kids. So say what you will about the millennials, and there's so much that we can, so very much that we can say. They have something going for them that no other millennial cadre anywhere in the world does. They exist, which means that they're consuming now, they'll be investing and producing in the future. So for the United States, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and we will get through this. But for the rest of the world, not so much. Let me give you an idea of the scope. What we've got here are the GDPs for the world's top 50 consumption-led economies by size. Here's where they are in 2020, and here's where they will be in a decade. So significantly smaller, noticeably smaller. But the real change is what happens with the export-led countries. They simply age out. Today, we have one country that is already post-growth Japan. But in 10 years, it gets really ugly. We are at peak consumption, peak production, and peak capital right now. And in this calendar year, they'll turn. Or at least that's how it was supposed to be. And then coronavirus came along. What we've got here are 5 of the world's largest consumption-led economies, plus Canada. You guys are an export-led economy. And this is 7-day moving average for new coronavirus cases on a per capita basis. So the data is broadly comparable. Now, anything that is above that double red arrow, that's 5 per 100,000 per week, that is considered the endemic level. Whenever your numbers are above that, the virus has become so entrenched in your society that you cannot root it out with anything less than a multi-month strict lockdown of the type that we have not done in Anglo-America, or a mass vaccination program, which luckily we are starting. Now, we also know that the data can't entirely be trusted. We know that for the advanced economies, especially for the United States and the United Kingdom, that we are undercounting by at least a factor of 3, so it's significantly worse than it looks here. And in the case of the developing world, most notably Brazil, we know they're undercounting by probably something closer to a factor of 10. So this is really the best case numbers, and it's really bad. And what this tells me is that we're going to be in a recession-like situation until we get rid of this globally. So the changes in consumption patterns that we saw starting last March, they've only intensified. None of them have gone away, and they're not going to go away until this is over and then at least 3 months after. So the consuming economies aren't really consuming, which means if you're an export-led economy, it doesn't really matter if you can escape coronavirus because you don't have anyone to sell to. This tells me that not only is globalization already over, the peak isn't this year. The peak was in January of 2020 when coronavirus started kicking in. This game's already gone, folks, and it's just a question of how you proceed and prepare for the future. Now, in the midterm, there's something that you need to think about that is probably not normally on your radar. It's about changes in transport that are inevitable in any world where you don't have global security. Now, during the 1980s, we had the Iran-Iraq War, and by 1983, the two sides had kind of met a stalemate on land, so they started lobbing missiles at each other's private shipping. The idea was maybe they could trigger an economic strangulation program. About 300 ships were hit, about 50 were disabled, and about a dozen were sunk. This is one of the bigger ones that actually went down. That almost destroyed global shipping and global insurance. No one had ever attacked a ship. In fact, the previous vessel that had been attacked by pirates was in the 70s. One of the things about the American-led global order is we made the ocean safe for everybody. And this was kind of a shock. And if you all of a sudden you had shipping companies that were actually cashing in their insurance policies, and since there are no loss provisions for something that they didn't think could happen, we saw first the shipping insurers go out of business, and then it started to hit the reinsurance companies, and that would have caused a cascade through the entire insurance industry globally. Luckily, the Reagan administration stepped in and reflagged tankers from Kuwait and a few from Iraq and shuttled them back and forth. And whenever the Iranians took a shot at them, the Americans shot back and blew up a lot of stuff. And that saved things. But that changed how the way we handle maritime insurance. Now, if you want to get an insurance policy, you have to pay a premium that's about 2.5% the cost of your hull annually. But you can't sail into anywhere where there's a war zone. Should you do that, your policy changes, and the cost of the premium goes up by a factor of 100 that has to be paid weekly. That assumes no one in the war zone is shooting at civilian shipping. Should that happen, your policy is null and void. Which means as soon as we have our first little real spat, Global shipping is impossible to places like Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, Sweden, Germany, Japan, China. These are some big places that really matter. We're going to be moving away from the sort of big ships that handle the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific trade that we're used to, and we'll go to something a lot more like this. It spreads out the risk, but these things are not ocean capable. Now, for you, this is a mixed bag. You have access to the two fastest growing beef demand sources in the world, Mexico and the United States. It would be nice to be able to continue to access the East Asian Rim, but I wouldn't count on it. The Japanese will be able to provide some security, and that market is probably stable, but it's not going to be risk-free. Korea even more so. And China, forget it. So these marginal gains that we've seen in Albertan exports in the last 20 years, those are going to unwind. It's going to be the same on my side of the border. We're going to have a much more compartmentalized market. Now, again, you guys send 75% of your product to Mexico and the United States. That's probably broadly okay. In fact, I might have some good news for you on that in the short term, and it has to do with COVID. Now, I'd like you to meet William Shakespeare. That's actually his name, Willie Shakespeare. He was the second person that the United Kingdom gave the new vaccines to. So I mean, say what you will about the Brits, marrying historical memories to a marketing campaign. Well, you're Canadian, you totally get it. They're very good at that. Anyway, he got the Pfizer vaccine, which was the first one out of the box. It's mRNA technology, which some people are apparently afraid will turn them into sterile lizard people, which is ridiculous because it doesn't do anything like that. It's based on basically gene therapy, which we've been doing for 30 years now. So it's a proven technology. We've just never used it in a vaccine before. But it has been through the largest field trial in human history, so I'm really not worried. Anyway, there's some problems with the vaccine, not on the health side or the effectiveness side, but on the distribution side. It takes 2 shots rather than 1, which we're broadly not set up for anywhere. In addition, it requires storage at negative 70 degrees centigrade. So you have to have dry ice. And that means that most hospitals, much less primary care physicians or pharmacies, simply can't handle it. So this is the first one, and that's important, but it's not the one that most of us are going to get. The second one out is Moderna, and it's already been approved for use both in Canada and the United States as well, and it's already in mass distribution. The big difference between Pfizer and Moderna is it's still mRNA. It's still 2 shots, so big negatives, but it can be stored in a commercial grade freezer, and that dramatically increases the number of places that can use it. So instead of just high-end research institutions and really big hospitals, smaller hospitals can handle this as well. Still not pharmacies, still not most doctors' offices. But because of that little difference in distribution, more people have already gotten the Moderna vaccine in North America than the Pfizer one, and that's not going to change. The third one, AstraZeneca or the Oxford vaccine, it's going through approvals in North America right now. It's probably going to be a couple more weeks, but it will definitely be out in February. Still mRNA, still 2 shots, but it can be stored in a refrigerator, which means now that anyone who could handle normal vaccines can try their hands at this one. It's also an easier manufacturing process and a cheaper one. So we will probably, by the time we get to April 1, maybe April 15, more people will have had this one than the other 2 put together. Now that's more global. This is really more of a European vaccine than an Anglo-American one, but it's still going to be part of the mix. But I'm really hopeful for the fourth one, the Johnson & Johnson one through their Janssen subsidiary. Not only is it not mRNA, so none of those lizardmen fears, but it's a single shot and it can be stored in a refrigerator. So anyone who could give vaccines before can just slot this into their normal program. They don't have to worry about having a second shot in reserve. Easy peasy. In the United States, Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J anticipate that they will have 100 million vaccines each in full distribution by April 1. And because J&J's only require 1 shot, You're talking a total of 200 million people being immunized with just that, and their manufacturing continues to ramp up. So in the US, we should be able to achieve mass immunity by June 1st. And then all that surplus production will first go to Canada, second go to Mexico. So you guys will be done a month, maybe 2 months after that. Add in 3 months for economic recovery. And in the US, we're looking at fully emerging from the coronavirus recession probably around September 1st. Now, for you guys, obviously, that's a godsend. American consumption of everything has dropped. Our consumption patterns have changed. Our restaurants are operating at most at 1/3 capacity, and roughly 2/3 of the money that is made from slaughtering a cow goes to things like steaks, which right now we're just not eating as much at. So getting people back out in the world and going to restaurants again is brilliant for you guys, and we will get there soon. We still have a couple of dark months ahead of us. We have the new variants that we're kind of racing against with the immunization, but we're looking at September, everything being back to more or less normal. The rest of the advanced world will follow later this year, and then the developing world will probably get taken care of by the end of 2022. So we finally have a roadmap for what the recovery looks like. There are lots of things going on in the world right now that are going to kind of break out in this next year that I want to talk about. This isn't just US stuff. This is stuff that's really going to impact everyone, but Biden is going to have to be taking the point on a lot of it. So first, with the Russians, we're going to get extension of the nuclear deal for the START talks, which will hopefully prevent us from engaging in massive nuclear exchanges anytime soon. That'd be really nice. But we're going to still have a broad scale collapse in American-Russian relations. Europe's going to get caught in the middle of that. The Europeans are trying to find a way, they're desperate to find a way to have their cake and eat it too. Have the Americans still provide strategic overwatch, but then ask for absolutely nothing in return. That's one of the reasons why the Europeans liked Obama so much. He never asked anything of them. But Nord Stream 2 is dead. The Navalny situation is getting really ugly. The Europeans' decision to sign an investment deal with China within a month of everyone accusing China of genocide publicly, none of that is going to resonate well in Washington. And if the Europeans do not change their tune very, very quickly, the trade war that Trump was sliding towards is going to actually happen under Biden, and any country that sides with someone on the other side of a trade war is someone who's going to have some very severe problems with Washington. The US right now is in no mood to be an international leader, and it's unclear whether Biden would even have the skill set to do it. It's very America, 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 and the trick for a country like Canada is to convince Americans that Canada is part of the American family rather than on the other side of the equation. It's too soon to know how that's going to play out, but the United States is not going to be a friendly power in trade relations with anyone. So the fact that NAFTA 2 is already negotiated, fantastic. Second, Iran. We'll probably have a new nuclear deal. It will not be based off of the old one that happened under the Obama administration. The Obama team has already made it very clear that the situation is different, and it is different. The Iranian economy was crushed by the Trump administration. And so Biden would like to start negotiations on the New Deal from that understanding that Iran brings very little to the table here and is simply going to have to capitulate on a lot of terms. That will get messy. And I will underline that the United States is no longer patrolling the Persian Gulf. We have already had the Iranians hijack a South Korean vessel during the last couple of weeks of the Trump administration. Trump did nothing. Now Biden's done nothing. The days of Overwatch are gone. So we could have a disruption to oil markets this year that is absolutely monumental, that would shatter the entire East Asian and European economic systems. I'm not saying that's doomed to happen, but all the pieces are in place and all the guns are already pointing at the right direction for that to explode. Third, the bottom left, that is Catherine Tai. She is the new American U.S. trade representative. She's responsible for negotiating and enforcing all the trade deals that the United States has. And she's woefully underqualified to be a negotiator. She used to be a congressional staffer until a week ago. She's never led a large staff or a negotiation with a foreign power. But honestly, that's fine, because the United States doesn't want to pursue any other trade deals. The Biden administration will go after one with the United Kingdom. It's not a high priority, but it'll happen because Trump did a lot of the heavy lifting there. And Catherine Tai can carry that to the finish line. But the reason Biden hired Tai is that she's a trade lawyer. He wants to sue anyone who is not abiding by the letter and the spirit of American trade law, which is pretty much everyone. You really don't want to be on the other side of the USTR when she has nothing else to work on. So for countries that think that Biden is going to be a more collegial trade relationship and more collegial negotiator than the Trump administration, wow, they're in for some horrible shocks in the next few months. And then finally, there's China. The Trump sanctions are going to continue. Biden's already made that very clear. We're already doing, when I say we, Americans are already doing freedom of navigation sales in the South China Sea with aircraft carrier battle groups, which is something we've never done. We're expecting a big policy shift on Hong Kong within the next few days. The Trump administration rolled a couple grenades into the relationship on their way out the door, calling Xinjiang a genocide, because, it is. And saying that any American political officer can go to Taiwan at any time without preparation in their official capacity, which is like that far from formal recognition. And then, of course, Catherine Tai herself, in addition to be a trade lawyer, she's Taiwanese. So the Chinese have already detected that there's a full court press coming against them from the United States on everything: politics, human rights, strategic issues, environmental issues, energy issues. We've already sanctioned their equivalent of Chevron Texaco. This is going to be a horrible, horrible year for American-Chinese relations. And the Chinese have a tendency, when they get pressured, to just stop buying American products. Countries who try to fill that gap, unlike Trump, who wouldn't use the bureaucracy, Biden will. And there will be secondary trade pressure on countries that try to benefit from this. I do not see this ending well for very many players at all. This could be the year, independent of what's going on with the Russians and the Europeans and trade negotiations and Iran and the energy markets. This could be the year that China crashes for all kinds of other reasons that may or may not be brought on by Americans. Okay, one final thought. Since 70% of your market is in the United States, I thought it would be good to end with a little bit of talk about where Americans are moving to, because we are in the greatest internal migration since 1950. It's kind of a big deal. There's three big things going on. First of all, the millennials are having kids, and they're discovering you can't do that when you live in Manhattan or in the Castro. So they have to move to a place where it's cheaper to live. And that's largely what this map is about. It's not a population density map. It shows the urban footprint of our top 80-ish metropolitan centers. And they're color-coded based on whether or not the city can physically expand. So cities in green and blue can expand in almost any direction. So they can expand out. That keeps development costs low. Second, if you are red or orange, you can barely expand at all. So if you're going to bring in more people, you have to go up, and going up is expensive. So we're seeing people move to the greens and the blues. Second, the baby boomers hit mass retirement next year. They don't want to shovel snow. And unlike Canada, where they just have to suck it up, in the United States, they have options. So they're moving where it's warmer. And then third, because of COVID, nobody wants to be stuck in a constrained space with other people. So busing, subways, metro systems writ large have gone from being big selling points to cities to big drawbacks. All the cities in the United States with high quality metro networks are in circles. So people are moving out of those. So writ large, Americans are moving south, west, and southwest to get into places with lower living costs, warmer winters, and a place where you can use your car. Okay, that's the stage that's set. And so we're going to bring in Dr. Key now to apparently make me cry, which I guess is something I'm looking forward to.
Morning, Peter.
Good morning.
I think all of us that are watching, as predicted, would have really enjoyed your presentation and your overview of the macroeconomics that are likely to affect us going ahead. It would appear to me that your central theme that you've spoke on the last few meetings hasn't materially changed, right?
I'd say the big difference is instead of we're almost there, it's now we're there. It's
right.
Like we're living through the turn right now.
The theme of globalization has reached its peak, and from this point forward, for all of the reasons you've outlined, trading gets more difficult. U.S. becomes more insular, and I think that I'd like to move in a direction of talking more specifically about the Canadian situation, and then eventually get to more specifically the beef industry. But as your graph shows, Canada is a trading nation to a large extent. Only 36 million of us or so in a very large country, right? Obviously resource rich, and export is necessary to live in the manner that we have become accustomed. So with the Biden administration, right, some things that would have been predicted have already, happened. It took them 15 seconds to cancel Keystone XL, which shouldn't be a giant surprise given what he had said that he would do such a thing. Do you believe that is motivated by a green agenda, or that he truly believes in, or do you think it's just part of the overall becoming grumpier?
Well, something to remember about Biden is, though he's been in American politics since the late Neolithic period, he's never actually been in charge of anything. He was a senator, then he was the vice president for the most disconnected and disinterested president the Americans have ever had. So January 20 was the first day that he was in charge of anything that wasn't a political campaign. So it's very difficult to know what really drives him. Every 5 to 10 years, his political views completely evolve based on what the winds in the Democratic Party are right now. Right now, the winds in the Democratic Party are gale force and contradictory. So he's literally making this up as he goes along. He knows that the coalition that brought him to power is incredibly fractious and incredibly unstable. And the only thing that holds them together is they don't like Trump. And so it was sufficient to make him president, but it wasn't sufficient to move the needle in Congress very much. I mean, the Democrats actually lost seats in the House of Representatives, which is, shocking to anyone who follows American politics. So he can't do anything that's too nuts. Now, on this issue specifically, it doesn't really move the needle on environmentalism to cancel Keystone, because it just means that the United States would have to get that grade of crude from somewhere else that has a much higher carbon footprint. So there's no meaningful environmental gain here, unless you're one of those people who thinks that if you can keep it in the ground, you're actually helping the problem or helping the situation. That's not how that works. That's a discussion for another day. If it wasn't going to happen under Trump, it wasn't going to happen. Your government didn't push hard enough for it, and there were too many special interests in my country that were pushing against it as well, and so it's dead. It's not coming back. That doesn't mean that Albertan oil is dead, but it does mean you are capped at your current export capacity. The market will not get bigger. You're not going to get a pipeline to the East Coast. You're not going to get a pipeline to the West Coast. You're just locked in where you are. It could be a lot worse, but you know now for sure that it will never get better. And that obviously has to change a few political calculations throughout Alberta.
So you're not thinking that the pipeline to the West Coast, even though it's under construction, will be completed?
That it won't happen. There is no way that British Columbia is going to let that operate. They're probably going to do something very similar to what the United States did with the Nord Stream pipeline. They'll wait for it to be 95% completed and everyone to be fully involved and thrown their money at it, and then they'll find a way to kill it.
What are your thoughts on some of the other early comments that Biden has made? What do you think the impact of Buy America policy could look like for Canada?
Several of the things that Biden has said that he wants to do, for example, the idea that he wants to retool the American government's vehicle fleet to be 100% union made and 100% American made. There isn't a place in the United States that is union run that makes electric vehicles. So, that'll have to be built out. Now, normally I'd say that this is just blah, 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 but we have entered an area in the United States where fiscal conservatives are basically no longer part of the political process. Inflation is low, QE is high, debt spending is high, and no one cares. Also, we've got a $2 trillion stimulus package that is just around the corner. So the idea that government spending can retool parts of the economy isn't crazy like it would have been 5, 10, 15, 30 years ago. We are in a functionally new economic management stage, and things that normally would have been ridiculous all of a sudden are not just possible, but probable. The trick for Canada will be to approach people like Catherine Tai as early as possible and convince her that if you're in a NAFTA country, that your inputs should be categorized different than from countries that are non-NAFTA. I don't think that's going to be a heavy sell, but you'll definitely have to bring something to the table, and you'll definitely have to offer something unrelated to seal the deal. Trump took us into an era of transactional foreign policy. Biden is going to just deepen that trend, because if you don't have a global interest, then everything's a deal. And I dare say that the people on the Biden team are better at cutting deals than people on the Trump team writ large. So there's a lot of room there for partnership, but it will not come without you pushing hard.
Peter, could you comment on, we've all watched the COVID thing unwind and the stimulus packages, both, not only in Canada, the US, but around the world. And for us, almost old school type thinking, we used to worry in Canada about a 30 to $40 billion deficit, and now we're going to have 10 times that big, 3 to 4 billion. And the U.S. not quite the same, but what's the outcome of these stimulus packages, and how does the government ever repay these deficits?
Well, let's talk orthodoxy and then kind of go into the hazy future. The idea behind deficit spending is you use it to paste over temporary problems in order to maintain demand and avoid social upheaval in the short term, recognizing that you will pay a long-term price for that in the term of artificial spikes to demand, which will generate inflation, which hurt capital formation, which hurt business in the long run, which degrade assets, all that good stuff. It hasn't happened. It's not that QE doesn't have negative side effects. Obviously, it does asset bubbles. But since 2008, we've passed into a new economic structure. With global consumption peaked and now falling, the old rules seem to not be holding true, particularly for countries with hard currencies that can attract foreign capital. And Canada is obviously on that list. So inflation is low. It shows no sign of popping up. Here in the United States, we've already spent almost 20% of GDP in the last 5 years in surplus spending. That doesn't count the 10% that Biden's about to throw in. and inflation is still, if anything, dangerously low. It's like we're entering a period of disconnect where with consumption falling, but production still high, you can have disinflation and deflation at the same time, and that can get dangerous very, very quickly. So they don't feel that they dare stop the spending now for fear of dropping into a Japanese style deflationary spiral that we know that will kill you. So that's kind of where we are right now. There doesn't seem among policymakers, and in that I include the Federal Reserve, to be a risk to this, or at a minimum, the risk of not acting is worse. Longer term, bigger picture, every economic strategy that humans have devised in the last 500 years is designed for populations that continue to enlarge. More trade, more interaction, more finance, more technology, more differentiation, more integration, more people. That's over. It's over this decade. We know that the global consumption peak is behind us already. It only can fall from here. And so we know capitalism doesn't work, but neither does socialism or fascism or communism. We need a new economic structure, a new economic theory, and we are not going to figure that out in the next year or 2 or 5. The last time humanity wrestled with these questions, we argued pretty severely with ourselves on how to manage economics. I mean, we had the Cold War, we had the Russian wars, we had the German-French wars, we had the World Wars. It was messy before communism or before capitalism finally emerged on top. We're going to have to go through something similar. But the one thing we've got going for us in the NAFTA trio is the United States is the advanced country with the healthiest and slowest aging demography. Mexico is the developing country with the healthiest and slowest aging demography. So we get to watch everyone else wrestle with this first. And hopefully we'll learn a few things.
What are some of your thoughts moving forward on, I think the expression view on inflation, not likely, right? What are you thinking in terms of the equity markets, bond markets, things like that? How does the deglobalization play out in those markets?
Well, let me underline a couple things on inflation before I jump into that. Inflation is going to be wild. It's going to be all over the place, because if you, for example, let's say that there's a Japanese-Chinese conflagration tomorrow. Well, yes, we can relocate the electronic supply chain to North America, and we will, but not overnight. So all of a sudden you get massive inflation in manufactured products. But if the Chinese and Japanese are no longer importing the things to make these stuff because the market's been disrupted, then you have massive disinflation in the raw commodities that drive it. So we can have deflation, disinflation, and inflation in different sectors, in different countries, at different rates, at all the same time. And we're going to have that kind of churn until North America reshores a lot of their manufacturing capacity. And then things will settle out and we'll have a mildly inflationary, mildly disinflationary environment here, and the rest of the world just goes all wonko. Because we're fine for energy, we're fine for food. No other continent can say that, and that's going to give us an undergirding to our systems that no one else will have. With the bond markets, it's going to be a difficult time to be in them. I mean, we have this huge wave of folks moving into retirement, and normally that would mean that pensions all move into bonds because it's safer. But in this environment of bottomless capital and capital flight, you would expect demand for bonds to go for the roof, which would mean you would expect the yields on those bonds to collapse. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury have seen the greatest deficit spending in our country's history recently, and bond yields are almost zero. That's our new normal for a while. Stock markets are going to be weird. We know that the baby boomers are going to be doing a series of mass divestments as they move into safer assets, which would normally mean that you'd have a crisis of funding. We know that with the baby boomers retiring, we are going to face an independent crisis of funding because they just won't have new income coming in. That also would seem to suggest stock markets would fall. But between QE and just unprecedented levels of capital flight, we also have a lot that's going in. So we know, courtesy of the baby boomer retirement and COVID and everything else, that capital supplies have to drop and the stock market has to drop with it. But then we get these bursts of panicked and capital flight from the rest of the world into our system, which is pushing things up. So it's not going to be a straight line. It's not going to be an easy play. I do not want to be a financial analyst, but there's, for people who can read the tea leaves, wild opportunity.
In Canada, we've often thought that one of our competitive advantages is in agriculture. Certainly from first principles, you would think that, and certainly here in Alberta, as our energy sector has got pummeled from a variety of different angles, we always think that agriculture, particularly beef production and crops and so on, things that we're pretty competitive on a global, in the global sense. We've often looked to that as the future, and we've also viewed China as being a very good potential place to move this product. And it would sound like to me that you wouldn't be that bullish on the growth of the export agriculture economy that is present in Alberta, and that we in some ways are betting on for recovery here in Alberta, that we can have a better agricultural outlook and a better economy here.
It's definitely a mixed look, or a mixed bag. In the world we're moving to, when disruptions in supply chains become more normal, there are only 6 countries that can expand their agricultural footprint, and most can't maintain where they are. Now, Canada can maintain where they are, but they're certainly not going to be able to expand it. The cost of your inputs is too high relative to the United States. Alberta specifically, you got an arid steppe environment. You have to irrigate. There's certain things that you have to bring in from the outside in order to make your products possible. Now, a lot of those come from the United States. Those supply chains will be stable, but I don't see Alberta able to expand very much, if at all. And then on the issue of customers, China, I just got back from a pork conference in Iowa, and I told them flat out, it's like, I've been coming to see you guys for years. And last year I told you that if you bet the farm on China, you're going to lose the farm. I told them, this is the year you're going to lose the farm if you ignored me last year. It's not going to happen. Now, Canada doesn't have to deal with the political aspect like American farmers have. Last year, the Chinese government decided that they will only buy American agricultural products if and only if they have already scoured the rest of the world for every scrap that's available. And they ran out so up till August, they were doing that, and farm prices in the United States were awful. By September, they had run out of everything else. So they had to come to the United States, and all of a sudden American farmers are like, "Ooh, hey, we're back in business." It's temporary. This is like the one sector that the Chinese can actually hit back at the United States on. But if we have a full breach in relations, that is off. If the Chinese have an energy crisis, that is off. If the Chinese have a financial crisis, that is off. If they have a conflict with anyone, it's off. There's nothing about the Chinese system that is going to last for the long term. Now, on the other side of this, past the disruptions, and once you break a couple of those powers that are really problematic, like China, there will be more opportunities, even in China. The problem is not the Chinese people or even China as a concept. The problem is the Chinese Communist Party, which has successfully convinced most of the world that China and the CCP are the same thing. They are not. And the markets that Canadian products, and beef in specific, go to in China are the city-states of the southern coast from Shanghai to Guangzhou. Historically speaking, for the vast majority of the last 2,000 years, those cities have gotten the majority of their food not from the mainland. They import it from elsewhere, and they partner with foreigners in order to integrate into foreign supply chains. That's the future for China, but that's not going to happen in 2021. Probably not in 2022 either. You have to have a central collapse first. But once that happens, you've got the richest part of China, the most stable part of China, the most demographically stable part of China that wants to integrate again, and will be able to. In the meantime, Japan's a solid option. Southeast Asia looks interesting, but that's about it. Europe's kind of dig a hole and bury itself. The Western Hemisphere at large has plenty of beef. And the rest of the world just isn't wealthy enough, or is another competitor like, say, Australia or New Zealand. So yeah, there's some rough time ahead. It's a good thing that 70% of your exports go to the United States. And I would strongly take a good look at Mexico. You'll have to compete with American beef there, but their first choice for protein, whenever they have the option, is beef from north of the border, because they realize that their own beef is, let's just call it, sketchy.
What are you thinking in terms of the currency pair CAD-US through all of this? As an export country, it's beef.
Sure. I expect the United States dollar to appreciate versus almost every currency in the world. There are a very few exceptions where it might not be quite so egregious. Canada is one of them. Because you guys have a good export balance, because you export things to the stable market, because your products are high quality, and because we're already in an integrated economic space, I don't expect the split between America and Canada to be quite as large as it is versus everybody else. But I would still expect the US dollar to appreciate. We will still be by far the end destination for most of the capital flight in the world. You'll get a piece of that that will be useful. But in Canada, there are fewer places for it to go in per capita terms, obviously in absolute terms, but in per capita terms. So like, for example, foreign investors who are looking to sock money into American real estate, they go to the gateway cities, the places everyone's heard of: Los Angeles, Seattle, Miami, New York. But when those got too expensive, there were other cities that they have heard of. So they started coming in and going to places like Fresno, of all places, Las Vegas, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, Chicago, Lexington. And so, there's broad-based ability to soak it up. In Canada, if you hit Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, you're pretty much done. There aren't a lot of secondary cities. So I don't want to say that foreign investment in Canada is capped, but it's certainly concentrated. And is now so concentrated, I'd actually say that it's causing more economic problems in Canada than it's causing benefits. And that changes the currency profile.
If you were suddenly Prime Minister for the week, what would your top priorities be from, in alignment with some of the things that you've talked about? What should we do in Canada, and more specifically, what can we do in Alberta to improve our long-term economic fate?
Well, those are two very different questions. If I suddenly replaced Mr. Trudeau, or let's be honest, Ms. Friedland, she's the one who's actually running your country. That interprovincial trade deal that you guys finally got done 2 years ago, throw that out and unify everything. The only way that Canada can matter in negotiations with the United States is if you're all on the same page, and it's just not enough. You guys negotiate like you're 10 different, you negotiate like you're a really badly run European Union. And until you have full federalization of your economic policies, the United States just doesn't care. You've got to be able to punch your weight at a minimum. And the advice for Alberta would be completely the opposite. Everything that has a chance of making Canada matter more to the United States diminishes Alberta's power economically, demographically, and financially. So for Alberta to make this work, Alberta has to approach the United States directly and try to cut a deal independent of the rest of the Canadian Confederation. And those two goals are completely diametrically opposed.
The other topic that enters the agenda all the time is the discussion around climate change.
Sure.
In a deglobalized world, will there be a unified strategy around climate change, and will
No, there will not. Now, the Biden government has obviously rejoined the Paris Accords, but the Paris Accords are one of the biggest wastes of time in international diplomatic history. Anytime you've got an agreement where each individual country decides that can have an independent definition of the problem, an independent definition of what the word emission means, measures the emissions from their country themselves, there's no international arbiter, and then decides what their punishment is if they fail. I'm sorry, that is not what an accord looks like. That's just a waste of everybody's time. So Paris means nothing. And in a world without globalized trade, where oil and natural gas gets more and more difficult to move around, people won't use it as much because it'll cost too much, it'll be too unreliable. So they will move to what they have locally. And in most countries, that is coal. So there will not be a plan, and we will have broad-scale deindustrialization on parts of the world, and there will be a global depression, and emissions will go up. The United States is the first world country that might be an exemption to this, not only because we've got oil and natural gas abounding, both here and with our neighbors, but it is the first world country closest to the equator. So it has the most solar potential of any of the first world states. And the wind belt in the Great Plains is the best in the world. So the United States, without subsidies, with the technology that exists today, could probably get about 20% of its electricity from alternative, and we're well on our way to doing that. You tweak the technology a little bit, you get a little bit of a battery system, and all of a sudden we can use solar and wind paired with a very limited battery set to take care of surge demand. Well, then that's another 5%. So all of a sudden we're talking 25% without doing anything at the government level. You can't do that in most parts of the world. Germany's probably the best example. They've sunk almost 2 trillion euro now into their power systems, and their emissions have gone up because it's not a windy country and it's certainly not a sunny country. And when they decided they weren't going to do natural gas, their only other options were not just coal, but lignite coal, which is 20% water. It's basically like burning wet cardboard. It's been a disaster from an environmental and an economic point of view. And that's the future of green policy in a lot of the world.
So the bet on the green economy, you think, has some potential issues, because there's been a fairly significant resurgence, say, in interest in things like biodigesters and what have you, because of the California renewable RNG price, right? That's in a semi-regulated market. I mean, it makes some of these things, at least today, financially viable without government support. So do you see that as being as being something that will withstand the next 10 years, or what are your thoughts?
I hear you. Now, if you're green, I don't want to depress you. It's not like it's all bad news, but we started implementing technologies that we know don't work in geographies that we know can't take them, because it was an ideological decision, not an economic one. And that's why we're seeing carbon rising in places that are making these investments. It's just asinine. We need more materials science research. And one of the reasons that I watch California policy relatively closely is not because it's economic driven. It's, oh my God, it's not. But they have a degree of bureaucratic flexibility built in. They set a goal for emissions, for example. They leave it to industry largely to figure out how to get there. And they're willing to move the goalposts based on what happens with technological evolution. And that's a degree of wisdom that I'm usually not used to seeing out of Sacramento. So it's kind of nice. But it's not a straight line from here to there. And we need to invent a lot of technologies if this really is the goal that we just don't have yet. Batteries are probably the single biggest carry. We know it's not going to be lithium. It's not energy dense enough. It doesn't charge or discharge fast enough. So it can be a part of the solution in certain places, but it's certainly not the blanket advantage that a lot of people seem to think it is. And remember, if we electrify everything, we need 5 times as much electricity. You're not going to get that from solar with the tech we have today.
What are some of your thoughts on if we focus a little bit more on beef cattle, since that's our inclination here at Alberta Cattle Feeders, get fairly narrow here. The export data and various things for the last few years have actually looked pretty favorable, right? If we look at demand, I mean, demand truly has held up through COVID. Amazing, in some ways, amazing.
Shockingly well, yes.
Shockingly well. You know, we were always led to believe that you take hotel, restaurant out of play and travel out of play and so on, it would be, you know, catastrophic on beef pricing. So to me, there appears to be some, you know, unknown quantifiable factor here, because actually, you know, exports out of the U.S. are actually at record levels, right? So things have, and pricing, you know, has gone good. Certainly, the futures market is anticipating a pretty major increase in the price of beef in the future, right? i.e., this year and next year. So what are some of your thoughts on the short-term signal, right? Appears fairly bullish on the beef side, right? I mean, the negative is the high cost of production related to grain, but given that we're the type to live week to week, right? It's hard for us to necessarily see that things could get, you know, things could get pretty ugly here.
The single biggest thing arguing for the beef sector in North America in general, and Alberta in specific, is quantitative easing, because it's liquefied the entire system and prevented everybody from going bankrupt and given plenty of bridge financing directly or indirectly to absolutely everyone. And that has helped you on the supply side, and it's helped you on the demand side. And I don't expect that's going to go away anytime soon. Also, if things break down globally the way I'm expecting, yeah, you're going to lose a lot of demand in East Asia. But I think your bigger problem is going to be competition from Australia and New Zealand, who will not be impacted by the Asian breakdown. So there will be new product coming into markets that you think of as yours. This is one of those things that you might want to get along really well with Team Biden very soon, because you're probably going to want some export protection. I mean, the Kiwis are probably the biggest concern here. All of their stuff is grass-fed. It's all a side effect of their dairy industry, and they just dump it on the market when, you know, the time comes, because they don't need it. You know, there's like, what, 4 million people, 5 million people in New Zealand? It has to be exported. And we're already seeing some Kiwi products becoming competitive in Mexico, and, you know, they're obviously not a member of NAFTA. So a lot of the relationships we've become used to are breaking down, and I think that's going to make the market softer. On the flip side, your dominant market is the United States. That's 70%. And we are looking at a big resurgence economically here in the last part of this year. And, you know, when people go out to celebrate, there's only so much lobster they want. They mostly want steak. So that's going to be very good for you guys. But anything you can do to tighten your relationship with the Mexicans, I would do it. You got 120 million people who, economically speaking, in per capita GDP, probably 1/5 to 1/6 of the Anglo-American norm. And as they become more successful, and as there's more manufacturing coming back from East Asia, the Mexicans will benefit from that in an outsized manner. And the only protein they want is beef. Beef, 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 beef. Now, they know American beef more than Canadian beef, but I think that's something you guys can sell pretty straightforwardly. But it does require a different sort of marketing. There is no Mexico market. There's a Mexico City market, there's a Veracruz market, there's a Juarez market. Everything is very sharply regionalized, which is an opportunity and a challenge, but it is a different way of functioning.
Very, very interesting. we're getting close to our allotted time. I just thought that if you have some final words of wisdom in 2021 to enhance one's economic position, what would that be?
You need to forward position your heavy lifting, both with Catherine Tai at the USTR's office, with the White House, with the Mexicans, with anyone that you want to be doing business with in a big way at the end of the year. Time is running short. Catherine Tai's only going to be able to deal with like a dozen major issues. And right now you're not even on our radar. And if your goal is to tweak anything about the Canadian-American relationship, or honestly, the Canadian-Mexican relationship, you've got to get in now. If you wait until September, you're just too late.
Appreciate your presentation and your comments. It's been very interesting, and I believe that I've covered most of the questions that have come from the audience in preparation for this. I think our friend will have some final comments.
Peter, thank you. You are brilliant. And Dr. Jim, you are equally as brilliant. That was a great Q&A. And Peter, I just want to apologize right now on behalf of the Alberta Beef Industry Conference and all of the organizers. As you know, you were with us last year, and we gave you a nice speaker gift. I can't remember what it was. Frankly, I've never been, in the past, I have not been that impressed with some of the speaker gifts that I've been asked to give the presenters at the end of their presentations. We've given away salt and pepper shakers and fridge magnets and things like that. Well, this year, they invited me to be on the speaker gift committee to come up with, and I came up with what I thought was a brilliant idea. And what we were going to give you, and we would have given you had this not have been all virtual, was an Alberta Beef Industry Conference stress ball. And we were going to give you two of these. I saw these things and I thought, man, those would make great implants. Anyway, thanks, guys.
I wish I could see you guys in person. I look forward to be able to do that very soon, actually. And you know, the virtual format, honestly, I think it works as a complement to everything else, but there's definitely no substitute for seeing people face to face. So very, very soon. And Danny, thank you for giving me your balls, and I can't wait to see how you handle the rest of the conference without them.
At my age, I don't need those balls anymore. So Peter, they're yours. Wow, thanks very much. Amazing presentation. Is that guy smart or what? Like, he's certainly Mr. Good News, I'll say that. And Dr. Key Jim, you could see, was visibly depressed by the end of that Q&A, but that's all right. Anyway, put your phone down, put your device down, stop checking your Instagram and your Facebook account, pick up a book and enrich your brain. And this is a great one, Peter Zeihan's book, Disunited Nations. He's got a couple other great books called The Absent Superpower and The Accidental Superpower. They're all great reads. They will make you smarter, so be sure to check those out. Now, speaking about getting smarter, our next presenters coming up in just a couple of weeks are two very, very brilliant people. Dr. Cami Ryan and Dr. Kevin Folto will be joining us for a discussion on information and disinformation or misinformation. It sounds fascinating to me, and it's certainly going to help us navigate this crazy, crazy world that we're living in right now. So check that out, and they'll be on in just a couple of weeks' time. So I'm Danny Hooper, and take care, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.